Welcome back. We're going to get started with our next panel. Once again, thank you for being here. So our next panel is When America Intervenes, Is There a Strategy? Obviously, this is an issue that is hugely important at this juncture in our history. Running this panel will be David Sanger, who is the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times, and the panelists are Bill Keller, who is the former executive editor of the New York Times and writer and op-ed contributor for the paper now, Keren Yarhi-Milo, who's an assistant professor of politics and international affairs here at the school, Mike O'Hanlon, who is an alum of 3 of our programs. He was an undergrad, master's, and Ph.D. alum, so he takes a lot of typing to put his name in, who teaches here as well and is at Brookings, and Ted Kattouf, who is the president and CEO of AMIDEAST and a former U.S. ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and Syria. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks to all of our panelists. We've got an all-star cast here for the day. So we're going to delve right into a topic that Bill Burns talked about a bit in his keynote, which is the Syria problem, but we're going to try to view it as the Syria problem a little bit writ large, which is we've seen a number of different interventions by many different presidents. We've seen President Obama involved in the intervention, of course, in Libya and trying to extract us from Iraq and ultimately from Afghanistan. And what we want to explore here is not only the specific problem of Syria, but what lessons we've learned from those other interventions that might shed some light on where this can go. I'm delighted with our panel. In Ted Kattouf, we've got a former ambassador who was around just as Bashar Assad was coming into power, is that right?
Yes, right.
Keren Yarhi-Milo, of course, is an assistant professor here, but also focuses a lot on these security issues. My old friend Mike O'Hanlon writes on all these topics and much more, including, most recently, the military budget, just out from Brookings.
Thank you.
So we're looking forward to hearing from him. And then Bill Keller, who was in the 5-step recovery program from being executive editor of the Times. And,
Only 5?
Well, I didn't want to tell him about the others. And you have to pity the man because of his many other responsibilities. He also had to be my boss. And so this is not an easy task. I'm going to start with Bill because I always found as a reporter, usually the best part of my day when we were dealing with a big story like the Syria story was talking with Bill about how we frame the questions we want to go out and ask. And then I would usually feel by the end of the day or the end of the week that I was probably disappointing him by coming back with such paltry answers, because frequently journalists find that the formulation of the question is a whole lot better than what you find in your notebook by the end of the week. But Bill, both in your role as columnist and if you were back in your old role as executive editor, as you look at the Syria intervention problem, how do you define it? Is this a humanitarian intervention? Is it a national interest intervention? Is it a little bit of both? What kind of questions do you think that we should all be asking about?
Well, I'm glad you asked me to ask questions because I'm the one panelist who brings neither expertise nor wisdom on the subject of Syria, but I can usually be counted on to ask questions. I think the first question is, how do we define our national interest in Syria, which in the reading I've done, the president has not clearly done it, not to my satisfaction. Maybe somebody can pull out a reference that I've missed, but I have not seen a clear definition. And a sort of corollary to that is, at what point does a humanitarian crisis that is offensive to our values and our ideals rise to the level where it becomes a national interest that would prompt intervention? When does it become a Srebrenica, for example? I couldn't resist fishing out this speech from President Obama on foreign policy, which he made in March 2011, explaining to the American people our intervention in Libya. I'll just read one or two sentences from it. Some nations may be able to turn a blind eye to atrocities in other countries. The United States of America is different, and as president, I refuse to wait for the images of slaughter and mass graves before taking action. If that applied to Libya, I would be asking, why does that not apply to Syria? And the other essential starter question I would ask, given our experience, let's say our mixed record as an interventionist in that region, pardon my French, how do we keep from fucking it up?
Well, two very good questions, and let me... The second one, as they say, is not quite written for the family newspaper, but we'll find a way to get the essence of it. So let's start with the first one. And Michael, let me start with you on this one, because when I read elements of this same speech back to members of the administration who worked on writing the speech, first of all, they're not always happy to hear it. But secondly, they explain that Libya geographically was so different than the war in Syria that you could go out and, bomb people in the deserts before they invaded Benghazi, whereas in Syria it's been very much urban warfare. The president himself said on his way back from the trip to Israel, when he came back and talked to reporters in Air Force One, that he believed that because the opposition is so spread out around the country, it's very difficult. You wrote a column yesterday in USA Today that said that the Bosnia model here might be a better model for us than Libya. So talk to us a little bit about that. How do those two models differ? You can answer the first question. We'll give Bill's second question to the rest of the panel.
And by the way, David, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I wanted to also throw in, just in passing, a third country, which is Congo. And the reason I mention that is not to go off on a tangent, but the president raised that in a very interesting interview that he did with the New Republic earlier this year, in which he said to someone who's asking him, why don't you intervene in Syria? And why aren't the humanitarian stakes great enough to justify some kind of American participation in an intervention force? How do I decide Syria versus Congo, where, of course, the death toll, not so much from the direct fighting, but from the breakdown in the state and all the additional deaths that result from that, where it's also been so great. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Now I'm going to answer your question. And the reason why I think of this Bosnia model as a closer first draft to what we might ultimately do in Syria, even though it's perhaps not a perfect analogy and we're not yet there, is that what we're seeing right now is ethnic cleansing and separation, which is not unlike the way that the very interspersed populations in the Balkans carried out ethnic warfare in the early years of the 1990s. We talked a lot about how we had to do something. Many people in this room will be well aware of that debate, participated in that debate, perhaps tried to address that problem. But of course, for a couple of years, we found it just too hard. And one of the reasons was an invasion was undoable, but also the populations had not self-segregated yet enough that an intervention force could sort of position itself along the ceasefire lines. So you'll recall the Vance-Owen plan, where we tried to preserve all the cantonments of Serbs and Croats and Muslims. And it was too early in 92, 93 to do that realistically. So it took us a number of years to have the debate about first arming the Muslims and Croats and then trying to help them improve their territorial holdings a bit through NATO air power primarily, and then ultimately pushing the Serbs to a negotiated soft partition at the peace table, and then an implementation force to actually make sure that the ceasefire lines were respected. I don't want to argue this is a perfect analogy for Syria, but one of the reasons I'm putting it on the table is that I think those of us who would consider ourselves advocates of doing more, and I'm one of them, have to acknowledge that Syria is going to be at least as hard over time as Bosnia was. In fact, with Ryan Crocker sitting over here, I'll always remember one of his greatest lines about, we can choose to declare one of these wars over any time we want to, but the movie goes on even after we've left. So even if we push Assad out, the war's not over, the movie's not over. no more than it was when Saddam was pushed out in 2003. And so we better have a strategy that actually thinks about how we help the Syrians build a new Syrian state. And Bill Burns just alluded to that in an answer to his question earlier. So that's why I say an intervention force, with the U.S. being a modest fraction of the total, we're not yet ready for that. It would require a negotiated peace deal. It would require some kind of a soft partitioning and some cantonments, I think, of ethnic majorities here and there. I don't like this idea, but I can't think of anything better. But that's the best case.
Michael, let me just push you on this for a moment, because go back to Bill's first question, which is what's our national interest here? Let's say we did your solution. Let's say we took the Bosnia model. Is our goal to get rid of Assad? Is our goal to end the humanitarian disaster, which, as you point out, could well continue and worsen after Assad is gone? Is our goal just to secure those chemical weapons on the theory that that's the thing that could hurt our allies and the rest of the region the most? If you were going to pick them, what's your goal?
Extremist sanctuary and complete turbulence in the Levant, which would threaten Israel, threaten Lebanon, and every other state, including Iraq. That's my concern, and the possibility of sanctuaries for al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. In other words, the same kind of outcome that we feared could result in Iraq, which is why we didn't give up there in 04, 05, 06, even though things were going so badly.
So the humanitarian impulse that was in the Libya speech, that's not a reason to go in. The chemical weapons, they're not a reason to go in.
The humanitarian part is a reason. It's not the central reason. Mm-hmm. The chemical weapons, to me, is probably, frankly, a secondary reason compared with terrorist sanctuaries and this degree of state failure right in the heart of the Middle East.
Okay. Keren, let me take that question to you. I was just in Israel last week, in your hometown of Tel Aviv, and then in Jerusalem. I was struck by the fact that when I asked Israeli officials to what degree did they want the United States to go into Syria, their answer was not very much. They seem to want to keep their powder dry for Iran. So tell us why Israel, living right on the border, would be less concerned about that sanctuary, implosion, chemical weapons than we seem to be from a distance of 5,000 miles, and how our national interests here differ.
So I think this is very interesting to think about Israel in this context, and I think that Israel's stance towards Syria is one of still confusion. They're not sure what they want. So on the one hand, I can think of 3 good reasons, at least, or maybe 4 reasons, why Israel would want the United States to take more active part in the Middle East with regards to Syria. So first of all, we've heard all this talk about East Asia and the pivot in East Asia, and some Israelis and some in the Israeli government feel that the United States needs to reaffirm its commitment to the Middle East. So they want to see the United States doing more to ensure Israel that with regards to Syria, and more importantly, with regards to Iran, that the United States has the commitment and that it's not reluctant to get its hands dirty in the Middle East again. And they read public opinion polls and they see that the public in the United States is kind of tired, and they are very worried about what it would mean, not so much in the context of Syria, but in the context of Iran. They are also very concerned about the destabilized effects on Jordan and what it could cause, whether the chaos in Syria will spill over to Jordan, and then this is another major vital interest of Israel. I think that one other reason that that Israel would want the United States to act is because of the deterrence. So U.S. deterrence, and now is on the line. I mean, we had a very clear red line that was crossed. This is in some way a sort of a deterrence failure for the United States. Barack Obama said publicly that if Assad crosses the chemical, if he starts using chemical weapons, the United States will do something. It will be a game changer. Israel looks at it and say, we want others to believe the credibility of U.S. deterrence threats. We have a similar, a different kind of deterrence threat vis-a-vis Iran, but we want to know, we want to be sure that the United States is willing to stand by its word. We've had previous presidents, they would say, that committed to the idea that other countries will not cross the nuclear threshold, and they did. We had presidents saying that they will make sure to enforce or to do something in a case where a nuclear power transfers information or tools to another country, and that happened with North Korea and Syria, and nothing was done. So they want to see U.S. credibility. They want to see the United States doing more if there is a deterrence threat, or if red lines are crossed. So this is all to say that Israel really wants the United States to be more involved. But the problem is they don't want the United States to be, again, to get its hands too dirty in another conflict because of Iran. Because they don't want the United States to be too fatigued and too reluctant to do something more significant vis-a-vis Iran. I think they also know that there's no easy solution. They have their own experience from the Lebanon war. They know how prolonged that can be. They know that chemical weapons cannot be taken out with a surgical strike. So that will probably require more force, more boots on the ground. And I think that if we are talking about a Bosnia type of intervention, then what role will Israel play? We know from the first Gulf War that the United States had to restrain Israel from doing something. What role will Israel play if there is a major intervention? And will it be forced to not do something? So if you see last night, when Israel recognized that the Syrians were passing information or that the Scuds-D were being transferred to Hezbollah, they didn't have to think twice. They went in and they bombed it. What will Israel be able to do when there are more actors involved?
Well, Karen, let me just ask you quickly, based on that bombing, we've seen Israel twice in the past 3 months now take a unilateral action to take out missiles that they thought were headed to Hezbollah and into Lebanon. Can you imagine Israel expanding that mission out of its own national interests to join any international effort on the chemical weapons, to go deeper into Syria, or would they think that that would be counterproductive, that it would play right into Assad's argument that this really is a foreign invasion and so forth?
Well, I think that if the first Gulf, the negotiations with, well, Israel will have probably, some would say that Israel would need to do more, some within the Israeli government, and some would say it's going to be counterproductive. I think that at the end of the day, it will all depend on assurances from the United States as to what are the red lines in terms of when will Israel be allowed to intervene. And it's a very similar situation to what happened in the first Gulf War. So I think that they realized that if they intervene, that could backfire and maybe not be very productive in a situation where you talk about an intervention with Arab states, Arab coalitions from the Arab countries. But at the same time, there will be some red lines that Israel would say, well, we will have to respond if X or Y happens, if chemical weapons are being fired at us. Again, it's a very similar situation to the first Gulf War.
So Ted, you get to inherit the question, how do we do this and not actually make the situation considerably worse? So you were, congratulations. Second prize question is solve Iran. So, so you were in Syria when Bashar Assad first was showing up on the scene. This was a time when the intelligence agencies were all telling us, you know, he could be a reformer, we might be able to work with him. All through the Bush administration, I remember Condi Rice telling us we think there's a moment to split Assad away from the Iranians. We may be able to work with him. So two-part question. How did we get this guy so wrong, if we did, or maybe he changed? And second, since Bill Burns told us that the most immediate task is accelerate his departure, how do you do that?
Look, I believe in the law of unintended consequences in messy foreign policy areas such as Syria. And indeed, I've said on occasion that it's not the law of unintended consequences in the Middle East, it's constitutional writ. You can count on it. Ambassador Crocker preceded me as ambassador to Syria and then went to about 10 other ambassadorships. But he is credited with having said that Bashar al-Assad was the first real Ba'athist president of Syria, which I agree with. He was schooled in the ideology. He actually, I think, believed some of it, where his father was just a cynical vehicle with which to keep the various populations in Syria in line. And I also think we need to take a step back and recognize that there are two overarching issues in the entire region right now. And one, which has never been resolved, is what role will Islam play in the governance of these states? Obviously, each state is different, but none of the states, other than perhaps Saudi Arabia for now, has decided that issue. Secondly, in the Arab East, of which Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Jordan and Bahrain are all part, there is this toxic Sunni-Shia divide, and it's only getting worse. And we can argue why that is, et cetera, but the fact of the matter is it's very ugly, and it's very destabilizing, and you have to ask. I believe in questions. I'm glad Bill Keller asked questions, because I think policymakers need to ask themselves a lot of questions before they take any precipitate moves. And one man I think many people admire, I certainly do, Dr. Brzezinski said on Morning Joe a few days ago, do we really want to get in the middle of a sectarian civil war in Syria? Now, I'm not saying the administration is proposing to get in the middle, and I have the highest regard for Deputy Secretary Burns and that whole team, but it's clear, as you said, that we're looking to put our thumb on the scale right now to tip the balance at least enough to force Bashar to come to terms with the fact that he can't continue to rule Syria indefinitely. But how do you calibrate that? How do you get that balance just right? How do you ensure that the weapons, if you do provide weapons and training, that those who've been trained and those who have the weapons don't go out and commit some massacres of their own with them in Alawite villages or Christian populations? So I believe that we need to do everything possible in a humanitarian sense. I believe we do need better intelligence. We need to figure out who might really emerge as a democratic force in a post-Assad Syria. But it sounds to me like Ambassador Burns is saying, as did Ambassador Kurtzer in his op-ed in the New York Times, diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. We can't give up on Russia, even though they've given us every reason to give up on them. We've got to work with the Arabs, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. We've got to work with Turkey, Jordan. We have to try to craft some sort of a global answer to this. We can't do it alone.
Can I pick up on something he said? It just struck me when you referred to Assad as the first Ba'athist leader of Syria. It reminded me of a column that Tom Friedman wrote last year under the headline, "Syria is Iraq," another Ba'athist minority government. The analogies are sort of obvious, and I wonder if that argument hasn't become something of a paralyzing factor in our making of policy. If we aren't there's lots of reasons to be hung up on Iraq. I got the Iraq invasion wrong, so I try to be a little humble about this subject. But I wonder if, in addition to learning the right lessons of Iraq, we haven't also learned that it's kind of not worth the trouble of intervening, even though in this case we have, I think, a genuine national interest, which Bill Burns outlined, as opposed to a fabricated national interest in the case of Iraq. We have an ongoing slaughter as opposed to just misery and torture. Saddam had already vented his horrors before we intervened. And back then we had to assemble and browbeat and bamboozle an international coalition into coming with us. I think we would find a lot more willing, maybe not enthusiastic, but willing partners this time around. So I guess the question is, we used to talk about Vietnam syndrome and Mogadishu syndrome as bad experiences that made us wait too long to intervene the next time. And I wonder if we're suffering a bit from an Iraq syndrome.
Perhaps we are, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because it didn't turn out all that well. And we have the Sunnis in Anbar province almost in complete revolt against the Maliki government, not without some reason. And Kirkuk is still a flashpoint that has yet to be ignited, but I suspect that one day it will. I'm not suggesting, if we can calibrate, I'm skeptical of our ability to calibrate these things. I mean, that
itself is a bit of a Iraq hangover, because we failed badly to calibrate going in there.
Well, there is not an opposition. There are many oppositions, and there are many lines of ideology within those various opposition groups. But it seems to me one thing we have underestimated time and again in all of the region is the strengths of some of these Salafist movements. I mean, who in Egypt predicted that the Salafis, even if they're for now peaceful, would get, 20–25% of the parliamentary seats in a free and fair election? Who foresaw the force that Al-Qaeda would become in Iraq and the degree to which it would bedevil what we were trying to do there? And now we have this group, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is hardly the only Salafist group in Syria, saying we are Al-Qaeda. That's who we are. We're Iraq Al-Qaeda, but we've learned some lessons, so we're only chopping off the heads of the soldiers we capture. We're not chopping off the heads of the civilians right now. We'll save that for later. So I just think that we should do everything possible for humanitarian relief. We should do everything possible to insulate Jordan from the destabilizing effects. And who knows, that might mean at some point a corridor within Syria that we would guarantee, which would mean a no-fly zone, a no-go zone for the Assad regime. But I think these struggles are generational. They're not going to be settled, as the Deputy Secretary said, in 2 or 3 years. And this thing is going to go on. Think of Lebanon again. It went on for 15 years in various guises, and we finally ended up with no victor, no vanquished. And that's what we need to try to do in Syria. And I think that is the plan. We have not called for the military's dissolution, and that's a good thing. We want to isolate the Jabhat al-Nusras and the Salafists, come up with a more pluralistic opposition that favors pluralism, and try to get those, then maybe it is time for a Dayton or something where you get those guys in a room and you don't let them out until they come up with some sort of a formula for governance of Syria.
Bill, let me turn a version of your own question on you, which is to say that since we've got a president who has clearly had his worldview formed by Iraq, who came in determined to get us out of Iraq and try to surge in Afghanistan and decided immediately it was a bad idea and has been speeding his way out of there, he turned to a different strategy in the first term, a light footprint strategy where you look at ways of going into countries without staying around and building up their resentments. So that's what drones have been all about. It's what cyber weapons have been about. It's what special forces, increasing reliance on special forces has been about. None of those seem terribly useful in a Syria-like context. Is Syria where the Obama doctrine of using these goes to die? Is there another alternative that you see apart from that, as you do the calibration that Ted was talking about?
I mean, I'll start by just saying flatly, I don't know. And as a general rule, I'm an admirer of the kind of cool caution of Obama on foreign policy, particularly compared with the sort of activist hubris of his predecessor. I don't think the fact that you can't, conduct a zone and a drone and special forces, operation in Syria discredits those as tactics. There's lots to be said about how we use those tactics and how the decisions are made to kill people with drones, and the whole debate over whether you apply the same standard to American citizens, and so on and so on. But I think the fact that there's not an obvious use for those particular methods of warfare in Syria doesn't make them not valuable in the tribal regions of Pakistan, for example.
Mike, same question to you, because the Bosnia approach would make you think that there is a way to do this without boots on the ground. And the president in Costa Rica yesterday said that while he wouldn't, as commander-in-chief, ever rule out anything, he would just about rule out ever putting people into Syria. Is this doable without that?
I don't know. I'm not, by the way, the Bosnia model does presuppose a substantial number of boots on the ground, but after a peace deal.
Right.
So since we're not ripe for that, since the parties aren't there yet, even in my activist side isn't proposing this anytime soon. However, I think that Syria may have gone too far towards rekindling and igniting of ethnic mistrust to put itself back together. And so again, if Assad's overthrown tomorrow, the story doesn't end there any more than it did in April 2003 when Saddam was overthrown. Now, if that were to happen tomorrow in Syria, it would have been without a big outside force, but it would be with an even more discombobulated and disparate opposition than we've seen in most of the other major wars of the last, even compared to Afghanistan, for goodness sakes. I mean, Afghanistan at least had only 6 or 8 or 10 major militias you had to track during the wars of the 90s. In Syria, there are dozens, if not hundreds. And so the idea that these groups are going to somehow cohere and form a new government on their own and treat the Alawites with any kind of tolerance, I think it's a stretch. So I'd love it if it happened. But I think we got to get ready. Frankly, anybody, I think, has the moral responsibility to do this, not just the Mike O'Hanlons and Anne-Marie Slaughters who want to do more, but the Barack Obamas who said that Assad must go. It's on the administrations now to also figure out what happens when Assad does go. Because Libya was not only easier in getting rid of the bad guy, it was easier in terms of, even though it's been troubled since then at some level, in avoiding genocide and ethnic cleansing after the fall of the strongman. In Syria, these populations are still heavily interspersed. So I'm dubious that Syria will be able to put itself back together under any scenario that I can think of.
Well, Keren, that brings up the question of what the regional effect could be once Assad, let's assume that Assad sooner or later does go in some form. We assume unwillingly, but goes nonetheless. If there is then an implosion of the state, talk us through the implications of that for Jordan, for Israel, for Lebanon,
For Iraq.
and for Iraq.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer because, again, there's the law of unintended consequences. The things that we think that we've learned, this is one mistake that we tend to repeat is that we tend to think about what our own lessons are, and we tend to forget or neglect what the other actors' lessons, their lesson that they're drawing from the same experience, which sometimes is very different from what we're drawing. So we don't know exactly how it's going to all play out. But the fact, I think that if you are going to have another hub where you have this conflict between the different, the sectarians, the Shiites and the Sunnis and the Alawite, I think the first thing that comes to mind, the first danger is one of terrorism and training. This is where they all go. They all will have another hub to go and learn the skills, get real practical training. And a lot of them, and we've heard thus far, some of them have Western passports, and they go back to their host states, and we don't know. It's really hard to track them. I think that what we will be gaining from losing from a situation where Assad steps down is definitely that Iran will lose its #1 ally in the region. What I think is a very important, it's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it's probably a good thing. But beyond that, I think that you can have Turkey probably will play a larger role. I don't know how Israel will feel about that when you have the void of Syria, the Syrian regime. There is the potential for destabilized Jordan that I'm in particular very worried about. And so but beyond that, it's really hard to know how it will play out, because these things have the dynamic of their own, and I've learned my lesson not to make too definitive of predictions. The other thing we should say is that the United States could have at this point more modest objectives, and I think that we are kind of dismissing them at this point of our talk, because we know that what the real danger is this, what happens the day after. But for now, they could try to think about another option, a much less costly option of just funding the opposition, giving them lethal weapons, and we can talk and we can go through about what that would mean. I don't think that it will be necessarily successful, or that definitely will not solve the big problems. But I don't know, but maybe as a first step, to kind of try to give it a try, maybe this is what the administration will do if diplomacy fails, but before they're ready to commit to a full-scale multilateral military intervention. So.
Okay. Well, we want to be able to open this up to all of you, but before we do, since we have Ambassador Crocker here, and I know he's giving a talk later on, but if there's anything that you've heard here, Ryan, that you think we're missing, that we need to address, since you have, I think by this count, been ambassador to just about every country that we have named that will be affected by all of this. We'd love to hear it. There are microphones there, or you can just shout out from where you are.
You are correct in saying that I have been ambassador to just about every country. No sane person would spend a weekend in. I do have some observations on Syria, but maybe I'll keep you awake after lunch with you.
Okay. Any questions you wanted to ask the group here based on what you've heard?
Yeah, the one big one that you all seem to have taken for granted, which is Bashar's going to go. Well, what if Bashar doesn't go? Which I think is a better than even chance.
Better than even chance.
Well, I should say something about that in the sense that we need to think long and hard about what lessons to draw about how we, and this goes back to what Tom Christensen asked before. When we say publicly at the beginning of a crisis that the leader has to go, and this is an important question because we have the North Korean leader that is watching this. We have other dictators that are watching what's going on here. What lessons are they drawing? What lesson have they drawn from Libya or from Egypt? One lesson that Bashar actually drew is that he needs to be more brutal. He needs to repress even harder. That it's really for him to survive his own survival, not just in the idea of staying in a leadership position, but he has no way out. And we need to think before before future crises arise. Do we want to give those leaders that kind of option, that either you escalate or you die? And it could be morally completely unreasonable to think about giving them a golden parachute or the option of a golden parachute. But maybe in some circumstances, if it's something that we need to think about. In North Korea, this could be very dangerous if we keep this leader back to the wall with nuclear weapons intact.
Michael?
Thank you for the great question, Ryan. And I think when I talk about this Bosnia concept, it's because I want to agree with Anne-Marie that we need to do more now, but I feel like I need to think through what comes next once we increase the odds that Assad will go. And I feel like I have to at least have a plausible answer. So if and when we could get the international community to agree to some kind of a concept like this, then I'd be in favor of doing substantially more militarily to push Assad out. I want it to be a two-pronged strategy. So that's my answer, because I agree with your military assessment for where we are today.
Yeah, just since my job is to bring questions here, one back to Ryan, if you don't mind. Is your better than 50% proposition that Assad stays predicated on the fact that things continue as they are now, or would a significant American intervention change that equation in your mind?
I personally don't see this isn't Gaddafi's army. It's a very, very different force. We want a no-fly zone in Syria, we're going to lose aircraft. It isn't going to be like the alleged Israeli strike on the nuclear facility, you know, one mission, one time that they're not ready for.
Well,
I think we really should do is
we'll take that up during your
If
keynote.
I could, David, just one very quick comment. Ryan brought me up short last night with that question. We were sitting, I had the good fortune to be seated next to him at dinner. And I always thought I was the odd man out because on most panels, I was always saying it's going to take a long time to get this guy out. And, you know, I feel like there's even one TV host who, you know, it might have been I'm clumsy, but I wasn't getting invited back because this was supposed to be a black and white issue, and I didn't treat it as such, nor did I say at the outset that Assad was going to go anytime soon. I felt that he has real support. He has maybe 30% of the country behind him, and the professional military, which is largely Alawite, behind him. But that brought me up short because I was always assuming, yeah, obviously he's going to go at some point. They can't sustain, you know, the Alawites don't have the manpower to sustain this, and the morale is plummeting and all, but it's one of those things where you have to, he's right, you have to take it into consideration.
Karen, when I was in Israel, I heard divided opinion about the question of whether Israel was better off with Assad in power or with an imploding, leaderless Syria. The argument basically was those who thought they were better with him out was he's a friend of Iran. Over time, whatever regime is there is less likely to be friendly to Iran. The other argument was don't need chaos on another border that will spill over. What's your view on that?
Well, before I take this, I want to continue on this issue, the question about whether Assad or not is likely or not to step down or to be defeated. And I think that we have to remember that there are, even within the Alawites, you have the group that is very, very loyal to him, but you have another group there that the prospect of an intervention or the prospect of United States doing something or stepping up, this is the group you want to change the preferences. And maybe you can, because you change the cost-benefit analysis calculation for them. So you want to try to separate them from him. And I think that this is one of the goals. This is one of the goals that should be. Not look at the Alawites as just one group and they're all loyal to the Assad regime no matter what. I think that if you have credible assurances to part of that group, you can try to separate them or some members of the military from the regime, more and more so. When we can think about different ways that this can be done. So I totally think that there's the problem of air defenses. There's a training of the military in Iran these days, and they are getting very good guerrilla training in Iran. And you have the supply of weapons coming from Iran, and these are all making the situation very difficult. But I think we should not look at the Alawites as necessarily one cohesive group that will never break apart. I think that there is a way to do this, and I think that just the prospect of intervention could change the calculus, or potentially change the calculus for some of them. About the situation in Syria, if it's better off for Israel, I think that this is true also for some of the people here in the American foreign policy establishment who think about whether it's easier or more difficult to deal with dictators. And dictators give you more predictability. You kind of know how they all play out. You've learned how they behave in crisis. You had multiple interactions with them. You know what to expect for them. You know what their red lines. You know where the boundaries are. And people in defense establishments like that predictability. They don't, in that sense, they kind of are happy that with the Assad regime. But at the same time, it is true that we've tried, and Israel has tried, to pull Assad away from Iran, and it was unsuccessful. And given that Iran is the main enemy, the #1 adversary, this is what Israel wants everybody to be focused on, right? This is the real threat, and they're not kidding when they say that. The prime minister, at least, is very, it takes this issue very, very seriously, even though if you should look at public opinion polls, it's not necessarily all Israelis. So if you look at it through the prism of Benjamin Netanyahu, so maybe you would say, yes, I can see the benefits. But again, we've been into this situation before where we think one thing will happen, and we wake up the next day, and oh my God, we did not expect this. So given that whatever is going on with Egypt, and we're trying to figure out how to work with them, having another front is with the potential of spillover, the potential of transfer of weapons. It is scary. So the net is, again, I don't know. There's probably good reasons to think that Assad is going to give you more predictability, but on the other hand, that the situation, that given his close relationship and close tie to Iran is probably something that some people in Israel feel very, very worried about.
Well, let's turn to people in this room, and we'll start with you, sir. If you can just come down to the microphone.
Yes,
and
I want to, can you hear me all right?
please come down to the mic, otherwise we may not be able to.
I'm Dr. Hamid, and I'm the former director of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. I've known Michael and other people in this panel a long time. I thank you, Ambassador Crocker, because you stole my thunder. I was going to raise that question. You see, one of the great problems I had at the State Department when I was an advisor there, and as a professor in this country talking about international affairs, especially about the Middle East and Islam, we do not walk in other shoes enough. And that's one of our mistakes. This is why I'm so happy Ambassador Crocker raised the question he did, and Mr. Kattouf, Ambassador Kattouf, made his comments, because we have to understand, from the Syrian perspective, there are many people there, even among those who do not like Assad, who are saying, it's not your business to interfere in our country. Did we come to your country? If we came to your country, you wouldn't like it. We don't like you here. Secondly, as an expert on Islam, and I'm a serious expert on Islam, having grown up in it and studied at Najaf and Azhar, the Salafists and Jihadists are a bigger threat to us in the world than any Assad or anyone else that we know of. I say that as a Muslim, and I say that to all of you. Mark my word. These people are being funded by among the most radical people in the world, and they will die for it. So in a certain way, Assad is a buffer. And the other thing that's important to understand about Syria is that the independent people who started this revolution have been preempted and co-opted by the Salafists and Jihadis because they don't have the money, and they don't have the organization, and they don't have the incoming troops. I know this from having talked to two of those leaders in the last month. They said, we are powerless now. Our revolution has been taken away. So I do want you to understand these factors. So Ambassador Kattouf is on the right page, saying this is more complicated, and the question raised by Ambassador Crocker, and Dr. Hanlon, I respect all of you on this panel, but you're outsiders. You're looking at it from the outside. You can't. You better start looking from the inside, and if you don't, we're going to have a bigger disaster than we had in Libya. And also, please, Gaddafi was not a bad guy. That was the American mythology. If you were Libyan, you got free education, free medical care, free housing, and if needed, food. The point is this, though. He wasn't always a good guy, but the Libyan people were doing very well. This is why in Benghazi, the people saw him take that desert and make it green. That's why we'll never settle Benghazi, because the people there won't let it. They will never forget during this generation, maybe 2 generations. So be careful of stereotypes given to you by the media, including our friend Mr. Keller's paper and others, because sometimes they mean well, but they are not on the inside and they don't understand it from the heart. Try to remember that. Thank you.
The part of the comment that I'd like to just pivot off and really turn into a question of my own, however, is we hear the view that Syrians don't necessarily all want us, although we also hear a lot of Syrians say, why have you deserted us for so long? And that's been a very powerful message we've gotten from a lot of the Syrian insurgents as well. But we hear this idea that we should let things play out and let time take care of some of these problems. Then we also see on the ground that as time goes on, it's not working to our advantage in any way. The war is stalemated, and among the insurgents, the extremists are getting stronger. So the question that I have in my mind, which is why I've been trying to search for a better exit strategy, and if you don't like Bosnia as a model, fine, but we aren't even hearing much discussion in this country of possible exit strategies or solutions, is how do you believe that time is helping us? I don't see how time's making the problem better by keeping our mitts off. So, you know, all the reminders to think about the region and its sensitivities and the people's sensitivities, I accept that. But I would like to hear how we confront this reality that as we stay out of this, the problem's getting a lot worse, not better, and in a crucial part of the world.
Well, the comments that you made give one worldview, and another is represented in President Obama's speech that Bill quoted from in March of 2011, which was basically, without using the words, an endorsement of responsibility to protect, this UN concept that at some point leaders bring about such atrocities within their own boundaries that we have a moral obligation to go in. Bill, you seem to suggest from your first intervention that that alone was not reason enough to go into Syria, if I was hearing you right, that we had to have a national interest reason to go in beyond just the responsibility to protect.
Well, I should say one thing that I take very much to heart from what the last commenter had to say was that we often fall down on the job of appreciating the nuances and the the fine points of foreign policy, partly because we, and I guess I presume to speak for the media or the serious media, we are born with an American lens, we see things through an American lens, and we have to fight constantly to not let that be our only lens. So, having said that, I'm going to try and give a nuanced answer to your question, which is I don't think that it's a binary question. I think you do the calculating along the way. I do think, a young scholar at the Institute for the Study of War, Joe Holliday, wrote a piece a week or so ago looking at what Assad has been up to in Syria, and it's the kind of boiled the frog thing. He's managed to gradually escalate his atrocities, starting with artillery and then graduating to aerial bombardment and then the occasional Scud missile into a neighborhood and now allegedly chemical weapons. But just to keep below whatever you could call the sort of Srebrenica threshold, the threshold where the world is so indignant and ashamed that we feel like we have to do something. And I don't know where on that continuum you hit that point. Clearly, in the view of American policymakers, he hasn't hit it yet.
Hello, Lena Hull, class 2010. I enjoyed the conversation about comparing Libya and Bosnia interventions, and I wanted to ask, in both of those situations, it would be a multilateral effort, it would be an international effort. And oftentimes, especially last summer when there was discussions comparing Syria to Libya, the example that I heard was Europe primarily was in a very different economic condition when the question about intervention in Libya came about. And now it's it's got other issues that it doesn't want to, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the ability to respond to Assyria. I wondered if you thought that was a credible argument now, or what other issues, resources are in the minds of our international actors. And because I recognize this is about U.S. strategy, but we have to appreciate this is going to be a multilateral issue if it ever comes to head. So I wanted to hear about our partners and really what their priorities are, mostly Europe, but obviously other regional partners as well.
Let's expand that question and say Europe and the Arab League, which of course was in the Libya intervention and has been completely missing in action in this one. Ted, do you want to start with that?
Well, it's a good question. The Arab League, of course, perhaps understandably, failed badly initially in trying to make a difference in this situation. And as Bill Burns said, Lakhdar Ibrahimi is a gifted and highly experienced international diplomat, but he looks like he might be ready to throw in the towel unless prevailed upon to stay. The fact is that various Arab countries, not surprisingly, have various attitudes towards what's going on in Syria. And while the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the GCC, other GCC states, line up with the opposition, although the Saudis, I was just in Saudi Arabia for 10 days, and it's surprising how wary they are of the Muslim Brotherhood all through the area, but they are. So the Saudis actually might prove to be, to some extent, a good interlocutor for us in trying to figure out how to channel the aid to the right people and the like. But yes, Europe, I mean, France and Britain are there. They're in, they want us doing more. I guess they're prepared to do what they can. But Europe is looking inward just as the United States is looking inward. There's no, while John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others may come out beating the drums for intervention, you don't sense that the American people, and certainly not the people in Europe, are anxious for their governments to get involved in this conflict. Another question that hasn't been raised, and I'm not the right one to answer it, but if we go in more robustly, I don't mean boots on the ground, but if we get involved more robustly with the Syrian opposition militarily, how will Russia react? I mean, I think of Georgia. I think back to Georgia in 2008 and the mischief that Russia did there. The Russians may be the last believers in the Treaty of Westphalia. They really do not like intervention in the, quote, the internal affairs of other countries, not just their ally Syria. China has issues with the Uyghurs, with the Tibetans, and the like. And if we start getting more unilateral, or even working with a few other states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and ignore Russian protestations, I'm not saying they should have a veto, but if we ignore completely their protestations, what mischief might they cause down the road in saying, well, you set the rules, we're just following.
That's a really good question, but I would put an asterisk in there just to point out that the Russians have not entirely accepted the fact that Georgia is an independent country yet.
Anybody want to pick up the Europe part of the question? And when you think about how activist NATO was in the Libya case, how President Obama said to them, you guys go take the lead, how they ran out of ammunition fighting an enemy that wasn't shooting back. What lesson do we emerge about NATO and more specifically the European members?
I just offer a couple of thoughts. It is an excellent question, and even though our NATO allies are feeling strapped and their average defense spending level is down around 1.6% of GDP, which is way below NATO's official target of 2%, way below our number of 3 to 3.5, or I guess we're still closer to 4 at the moment. Nonetheless, the NATO allies have been far and away our most dependable partner in Afghanistan. They've stuck through a very frustrating war with 30,000 plus troops for a decade. Well, not that number for the whole time, but I've got to believe that if you could imagine, and again, I'm going to come back to my Bosnia model, because the airstrikes and the arming the rebels are economically cheap. What gets expensive is if you actually do wind up with some kind of a peacekeeping mission at the end of this. I think rebuilding the Syrian state, a lot of the economic and security aid that could be required for that would have to be provided by Arab countries, but I think that Turkey and other NATO states would have to provide a fraction of any kind of peacekeeping troops. And I think in broad terms, it would probably have to be in the range of 20, 30,000, in that rough ballpark, Turkey being the predominant partner, presumably. That's comparable to what Europe's been doing in Afghanistan. So I guess I won't try to say whether that means it's doable or undoable, but at least there's an immediate precedent.
Hi, Jeff Laurenti, MPA 1974. I appreciate the last question particularly because the opening discussion had been entirely self-referential, U.S. initiative, U.S. action without regard for international partners or potential adversaries. So the last question did, I think, set us on the right course that I'd like to explore a bit further. Even the French and the British, who are the most gung-ho among the Europeans about maybe doing something with Syria, shades of Sykes-Picot in 1916, and all that flowed from that a century ago, meddling in the region. Both of them still insist that you need a UN Security Council resolution for any kind of military intervention. And the cases that Michael had mentioned, whether they be Bosnia or Afghanistan, or for that matter, the Libya air campaign, all had United Nations Security Council authorization. And without that, they aren't playing in a military intervention game. And there is the possibility, as Ambassador Kattouf noted, that the Russians might not just be orally opposed, if the fact that they're fighting it in the Security Council suggests that they might feel they have a need to stick up for their guy if the Americans come in militarily and do something militarily. So I guess the question is, to what extent do these maybe little requirements of international law, like UN Security Council authorization for initiating a military campaign, should they matter to American policymakers? Without that, can we even pass a resolution in Congress to justify military intervention? And what are the risks of the Russians feeling they have to show they're not totally impotent? So to what extent does military intervention, in fact, trigger a whole range of other consequences? And if you take Bosnia, again, Michael's suggestion, perhaps what Bosnia represented was a 3-year international agreement that nobody jumps in. We keep a cordon around it, and after the parties have tired themselves out, which was essentially the moment at which the U.S. hyped the level of intervention, and there were boots on the ground, they just weren't American. They were Europeans for all 3 years in a peacekeeping operation. The Europeans often said that the Americans were the most aggressive about pressing military action. They're ready to fight till the last European. I think that this larger picture warrants a question of, isn't international intervention, haven't we learned from a couple of them, that it has to be multilateral and internationally sanctioned?
Well, this raises an interesting question because the constitutional lawyer side of Barack Obama would certainly say, we've got to go do this. It's what was missing before Iraq in 2003. Then somebody's bound to wander into his office and say, Mr. President, since you know this is going to get vetoed by the Russians, maybe with the Chinese egging them on, I wouldn't even go there to go try it because it will freeze you completely. So how do you walk that line? Karen?
I'm definitely not, I cannot take this entire question because there's parts of it that I don't feel comfortable answering, but I do know that it's, with regard to Russia, we have to remember, I mean, there are different interests at stake for Russia here. Definitely the prestige, definitely the principle of non-intervention. Syria is a very long ally, it sells weapons to Syria, but I think that what Russia really fears is to have a jihadist country that could have an effect and spillover and to other regions that will threaten its own regime. And I think in that case, you do have a convergence of interest between the United States and Russia. So there is room for diplomacy, and there is room to go and try multilateral, to go for multilateral interventions through the UN and not give up so quickly, because I do think that both Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the United States and Russia are all on the same page in terms of, and Israel, in terms of what they don't want to see instead of the Assad regime. So this is where you want to have policymakers who are really skillful at trying to figure out the quid pro quo and to figure out how to do this in this case. And we've had past policymakers doing it very well before the first Gulf War, for example. So I don't think that there is a reason to give up on on trying to go with the United Nations Security Council vote, or to give up Russia in that regard. This is what diplomacy is about, and I think there's enough. We are negotiating now we're cooperating with the Russians over the Boston bombing. There is room there to try to talk about Russia and with some creativity and with some understanding that we are really working towards a similar goal.
Bill, you spent a lot of years in Russia. Do you see any way that they can be brought to change their position?
I certainly wouldn't try to predict what Vladimir Putin would do under these circumstances. He's proof that you can take the guy out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the guy. But I think Keren's absolutely right, that viewed objectively, if you can somehow subtract from the equation the sort of impulsive, sort of nationalistic narcissism of the president of Russia, they do clearly have an interest that they share with us. How you bring that interest to bear on the actual problem, I'm not sure, but she's certainly right.
Hi, my name is Steve Fuzeshi. I'm a 1970 graduate of the Wilson School, and I have a sort of a legal and international media background. So one of the issues I'd like to posit is that domestic political structures and domestic political situations have a very direct impact on the kinds of foreign policy any leader can enact or support. In that context, the question I have for you, I now teach a course at Brown and Wesleyan about the impact of technology and globalization on international media, particularly news. So the question I would like to pose, because I think it's a great panel to pose it to, is what do you think the impact on the kinds of proposals and strategies you are discussing is of the current state of international media, which is highly technology-driven, highly instantaneously driven, and you can come to your conclusions about it. How do you think it impacts President Obama in his decision-making, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Putin, and maybe somebody like Bashar Assad? We were looking back in historical lessons, but has the change in the way the world is interconnected through media changed how we should analyze the ability to perfect our foreign policy decision-making?
I love the question, and I'm going to be a little bit blunt in response. I would say for Syria, no. Now, I think technology has been incredibly important in the broader Middle East in the last 3 years with many of the Arab revolutions. But I think what we're seeing in this war is a lot of old-fashioned things. Ryan Crocker talked about how the Alawites have been preparing for 30 years for this kind of a possible conflict, way before even email. And certainly, as much as we're all wringing our hands about this in comfortable and pleasant Princeton today, the issue on the ground is how do we, through proxy channels, figure out which insurgents we're potentially willing to help. Feels a lot like the debates we had about Afghanistan a generation ago, or other conflicts where we just wanted to help the anti-Soviet side in the Cold War. So to me, I feel like I'm back in history looking at this war in terms of the important levers. And then, of course, the American role is dominated by some good humility about lessons maybe we've learned more recently or relearned more recently, but also war weariness and casualty aversion, which are not new to the internet or Twitter or Facebook ages. So I'm struck how much this war is actually not affected by changes in technology, even though I accept that in many other ways international politics has changed because of all these new possibilities.
I think I mostly agree with what what Michael said, but and I'm thinking back to something Bill Burns said in his keynote, which I agree with, which is social media is really great for organizing a protest. It's not so good for organizing a political party or writing a constitution or developing what comes after the protests succeed or fail. I do think that social media and technology have played something of a role in keeping what's going on in Syria on the agendas of the outside world. I mean, there are a few reporters in Syria, but mostly what we're getting out of Syria is coming from Syrians who are feeding reporters who are outside of the country, just because it's too dangerous to operate there. And so, if we didn't have social media and the technology that we've got today, there's a good chance that Assad would have been more successful at keeping his, atrocities secret.
I would just add a thought, something we spend a lot of time on, both in the Washington Bureau and among our foreign staff, is watching all of these feeds come out of Syria, since we can't get many people in there, trying to figure out which ones have been manipulated and which ones haven't. I mean, there's a chain of custody issue about the chemical weapons, who used them, where they got used, and so forth. It's also true about every YouTube video that you see, every Twitter feed you see. The opposition is very sophisticated about how to go manipulate foreign opinion here. And frequently, just given the speed of electronic media, a lot of this stuff goes on TV, gets into the bloodstream before anybody's had a chance to check it out.
That's true.
So. Last two, and then we'll.
Hi, my name is Marina Mourani. It's the Mitchell inaugural class of MPPs, 98. I'm from Georgia, actually, and I'm glad that Bill shares the same kind of pessimism with regard to having Putin in power to countries like Georgia. I recently was participating at the conference on Syria, and there was a political scientist from Russia who, while talking and discussing Russian foreign policy, was point blank. He said, what does Russia get, while negotiating about its role in Syria? And my question is, what the US and international community is ready kind of to, bargain and use as a bargaining chip in negotiating with Russia? And should countries like Georgia be worried about that? Thank you.
You mean we're gonna for a little bit of help in Syria, we'll give you back Georgia?
Anybody want to take that?
Did he want to ask the question first?
Sure, we'll do yours, then we'll answer them all together in one. Great finale.
There's been a lot of talk about Russian interests, US interests, and how the US can sort of take the calculus of Assad, et cetera. So I guess I'm interested in asking the panel, what do you think about sort of Iranian interests in this, or Iraqi interests from the point of view of Prime Minister Maliki? I mean, they also have an interest in maintaining perhaps a deterrence against Saudi aggression that they perceive, or against a strike on their own countries. And so every time the US might up the ante and try and give a bit more weapons to the military, they have a lot more skin in the game. They're prepared potentially to send their entire armies into Syria to defend the regime if that means that the war won't come to their countries. Is there a role for engaging in Iran in international diplomacy on Syria?
Ted, should we start with you?
Well, the first question, I mean, I'm not other people can better address Russia than I, but we just had Deputy Secretary Bill Burns, who knows the Middle East intimately, knows a lot about Russia and Russian interests. And the Russians have some great experts on the Middle East, including the Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Bogdanov, who some of us knew in various times in our service in the Middle East. He's he's really smart and he really knows what goes on there. In fairness to this administration, I think I have reason to believe that they have looked for things that they could, bargain with Russia on. Not Georgia, by the way, but things that they could bargain with Russia on to, to keep Russia on board where Iran nuclear file is concerned, but also to, to get Russia to relent a bit on Syria. We all know the Russians are very angry about Libya. They're even angrier, but still about Kosovo. And they feel like Putin thinks, their nationalism, that they were suckered, if you will, and he's not going to allow it to happen again on his watch. But some people have also claimed that maybe another reason the Russians aren't willing to take the plunge with us is they don't really have the influence with the Syrian military and the Alawite community that we assume they do. And I don't know whether there's any truth to that, but I know some people I respect in foreign policy circles who study this stuff who believe that very well may be the case.
One other factor might be that they're making the same calculation that Ryan Crocker is making, which is, it's a little early to talk about post-Assad when we're not entirely sure Assad is going to go.
Right.
And if we reached a point where it was clear Assad was going to go, then those other interests that Keren mentioned would kick in.
Karen, any last thoughts on this?
No, I don't. I mean, I think no, pretty much covered.
I'll just say in regard to Iraq, and again, Ryan can correct us all this afternoon, but my take would be that even though Maliki is unhappy seeing an Alawite regime threatened and potentially at some future date overthrown, he's got to be fundamentally concerned about turbulence and chaos, because it provides any and all Sunni extremist groups that want a next-door sanctuary. So again, I just feel, as much as I don't claim to have the exact solution figured out, I don't think time's working for us right now, and that's just an important theme that I would want to emphasize as we conclude.
Well, thank you all. Thanks all the members of this panel, and thanks to all of you.